Jenny will be talking about how clients don't suck, resolving common blockers that stifle UX. Please put your hands together for Evgenia Grinblo.
Good morning, everyone. Hi. It's my first time in Manchester and nearly my first time this up north, and I'm really excited. So far, everyone is so lovely and so nice. Don't tell my boyfriend, but I'm considering moving up here, maybe. So my name is Evgenia Grinblo. I work as UX and design lead in a company called Future Workshops. We build mobile apps in London. And I'd like to address a misconception today, that doing UX work with clients has to suck. Now, I got my first client job when I was 14 years old. Up until then, I'd spent 2 years pretty much obsessing over design and doing everything I could to find out more about it, teach myself Photoshop, learn how to build websites using tables. And I was hoping that one day when I grow up, someone will think I'm good enough to actually pay me to do this. And then soon enough, that happened. And I got a wonderfully exciting project to design the outside of trucks for a company that made expanded polystyrene. So nevertheless, I was very excited because someone was willing to give me money to do design, and this was a great thing, especially at that age. And so I was so happy. I went to meet with the marketing manager of that company, and that was pretty much the last moment in the project when I felt happy. Because from then on, everything that could go wrong went wrong. We argued a lot. He didn't like my first mock-ups. I didn't understand exactly what they wanted. And in the end, we ended up with some mix of what I thought might work and what he thought needed to work. And I was extremely frustrated. And the interesting thing is that since then, even though I've lived in 2 other countries and I've moved from visual design to user experience, nevertheless, I keep hearing these horror stories or frustration stories from people who work with clients, and I still experience some challenges working with clients. And it's become almost a cliche in our industry that clients can be nightmares. There's even a website dedicated to it called clientsfromhell.net. On a really bad day, I like to spend time reading stories there to remind myself how wonderful my clients really are. And I brought 3 examples from the website that I thought were particularly amusing. So these are quotes from clients. Third one, although it's not actually linked to the second one, I think might be from the same person. Now, while it's very funny to make fun of silly client stories, and by virtue of being human, I'm sure some clients can also be psychotic or somehow unreasonable, I think the assumption that working with clients can suck and can be difficult, and the challenges that we face working with clients can have a real cost to us, to the client. It can be through delays in the project. It can be through frustration, through problems in the relationship that can cost us repeat business. And on a personal level, I've experienced sometimes the sense that how can I really bring my passion and put myself on the table in a vulnerable way and do what I love when I know I'm going to face certain kinds of problems or certain kinds of challenges? Now, in an ideal scenario, clients can be wonderful. And the reason for that is because when you're working with many different clients on different projects in different industries, you get to learn from them about their domain because they know their stuff in depth and they care about what they're building quite a lot. So in an ideal scenario, they can bring all of the stuff that they know, and then you can bring all the stuff that you know, and you can create something great together. And I've been really lucky to have that experience happen many times. Just in the last 4 years of being at Future Workshops, I've become an expert on golf, although don't ask my client if they believe that that's true, on how banks train people to give customer service, what people do in Dubai in their free time, things that I would never be able to become so invested and interested in such a short time in order to do a good job unless I had partners on the other side who did it all the time. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. So over the last few years, I've been thinking very hard about building a toolkit for myself that I can draw on and use whenever I come across challenges with clients that I found are almost repeatable. They seem to have a pattern to them. So I'm going to talk to you about that, and I'm going to tell you 9 things that I've been using that have worked really well for me to tackle some of the common challenges that I come across. And as I'm speaking through them, think about picking one that you think, this could be something that would work for me or something that I'd like to try. And I'd love to hear from you which one you think might work and why. Now, before I get down to the nitty-gritty, just a disclaimer. There's not really a silver bullet or one method or one tool that I found that really can solve every client problem or can make our clients into angels. But when I first start working with a client, I try to understand and do a bit of diagnosis to understand how the client thinks and what symptoms I'm seeing for what might come later and what challenges I may face. And I do this when I'm collecting everything that I need in order to do my job, when I'm asking them about previous research that they've done, other work that they've been doing, whether they already have a product and what it's like. When I'm collecting all the things that I know I need in order to do my job, I'm starting to feel for certain symptoms. And usually, there are 3 conditions, I call them, 3 ailments that I find clients can fall into. So I'll share those 3 ailments with you today, and then a little bit of my toolkit in terms of what I do to tackle those and move the relationship forward. So the first condition I call design in the boardroom. And you might know that you're in the presence of someone who likes to do design in the boardroom when you see certain symptoms. So if you're in the presence of a person who says, I don't need to talk about users or do user research because I'm the user for this product, you know that you're in the presence of a person that might need a little bit of tweaking. Well, not the person themselves, but maybe the way that you work together. A lot of time you also see that people might rely on their opinions in order to make decisions, and so there's a lot of argument between them and other stakeholders on the project. And finally, there's a bit of featureitis and also surprise features. And they can be surprising because they make very little sense for the product you're building, or they can be surprising because they spring up just out of left field in the middle of the project. But when I spend time with clients who behave in this way, of course it can be frustrating, but I found over time that there's something under the surface. And there's a reason that they behave in this way. And I find that the reason is that oftentimes this is a client who's bringing a way of working and a method and process and mentality of working from their native environment and trying to apply it to the way that they're working with you to create a user experience. And that can sometimes be a little bit less than productive because they have a way of making decisions and using hierarchies that means that they are used to sitting in a boardroom and writing down requirements. And as we know, that doesn't always work. Or very rarely works, in fact, in my experience. So what I try to do in this environment is to try to shift the conversation entirely from making decisions and being authoritative and existing in that native space for that client in that headspace. And I try to shift the conversation to the fact that we're designing, in our case, an app for real people. And I do 3 things that can really help with that. The first thing that we try to do is we try to use any method that we can to bring user voices into the boardroom. And what I mean by that is when we have gone out and done user research, we oftentimes don't have the luxury of our clients being present for that. And of course, our instinct is to try and summarize it for them and to make it very actionable. And so oftentimes, we want to present the conclusions to them. But instead, we try to tell them a story or to bring actual examples of users speaking about themselves. And the reason for this is when we see someone's face or we hear their voice or we hear the story arc, the neuroscience has shown that our brain actually changes the way that it thinks, and it starts to act in a way that generates empathy. So what empathy does is really great because it's a huge shortcut for UX work. It basically means you don't need to convince your client of a conclusion. The user can do it for you. So I've brought an example from one of our projects in terms of how we might approach this on a day-to-day basis. So hands up if you follow golf. Okay. The majority of people in the room are just like I was when I started working with the Open Championship. So the Open Championship is a client of ours for the last 6 years, and I've been involved with them for about 3 to 4 years. And they're basically the oldest, most prestigious golf tournament. They're like the Wimbledon of golf. And every year we work with them to build and improve the native mobile apps. And the interesting thing about this project is the championship is only on for a week. So we have an entire year to think about everything we're going to do with no exposure to users. And then for 1 week, everything happens. We can observe people. And during that time, all the stakeholders and everyone on the client side is really busy getting the event together. And then when the event ends, we sit in boardroom meetings, and because there's so many people who have to make decisions on what we're going to do with the app next year. And so what we try to think about is how can we empower our client to be in touch with their users without kind of shortcutting the situation for them. So we still present conclusions, we still present the research that we've done, but we also play them little clips of recordings that we made when we were out observing people. So I'm going to play you a clip from a user from last year who I asked, I noticed that he was sitting behind the grandstand in a place where you can't see any golf, and he was looking at his iPad. So I went up to him and I asked him, why are you looking at your iPad? And this is what he said.
To answer your question, it tops off the experience. So if you want to, like we're doing right now, taking a beer, having some lunch, you can just keep an eye and you don't have to be finding a seat in that direction or whatever. It's there and it's live and it's in front of you. I think with the iPad, I don't know if many people bought an iPad, but if you have this, then it's going to be a lot better because you can see it much more visually. So if I was coming next year, I would definitely bring the iPad. I'm actually doing some work on it while I'm actually here. This is why I bought the iPad. But knowing now I've experienced this in the iPad, I would actually bring the iPad next year. It definitely enhances the experience. My biggest complaint as to why I would not come to an event like this is you actually don't see much golf. So with this, you can see the golf, you can follow the golf.
What prevents you from seeing the golf?
These 50,000 people. It's hard to get around. Well, it's a lot. You can only see certain shots, certain swings, and so on. Whereas with this, you can follow it. You can watch the details. So if you're standing somewhere down there, you could be watching the player in detail and just taking a glance.
Right. So if you notice, what happened to all of you when we listened to this clip is that you laughed. And it's a very natural reaction because what the guy was saying was funny. It was slightly ironic. And interestingly enough, it became a pivot point for the RNA's strategy in terms of how they approach the mobile apps. Because up until that point, we were focusing a lot of our time on the biggest user base that we had, who were the fans everywhere else but the championship. And when we started observing people and talking to them, the golf fans who were at the championship itself, we realized even though they're there, they're not actually getting a far better experience in some cases because there are crowds, there's a lot of things going on. And so we've been spending a lot of time on changing the apps and enriching them to solve the problems of people actually at the Open Championship. And one of the things we did this year is we launched one of the biggest installations of iBeacons in a sports event. And so what that means is if you're sitting at a grandstand, you can pull up your phone. It knows where you are, and it gives you information on who's coming up, who's about to come, who's just played, and it gives you a lot more context. So that really helped with our convincing process, so to speak, which would have been very different if we couldn't get people on board in that way. Now, oftentimes, another thing that happens with people who are used to designing in the boardroom is that you'll get into arguments about how to do things in the interface, and then one person says they prefer this, and another person says they prefer that. Usually someone quotes their favorite app, and then we end up in a bit of a cycle. So on projects where we don't have user testing on a regular basis set up in the plan, what we'll often do is we'll just print the design or the wireframe or a screenshot of what we're talking about and go out onto the street and intercept people in the street, which in London can be difficult because people are always canvassing and trying to ask you for money. But regardless, we find nice people and we run some scenarios with them to see what they would do. And usually it really helps the client and the stakeholder team because then they have something else to inform the decision of what we're arguing about. So I really encourage you to try that if there's ever that kind of exchange where there's a very long-winded argument and it doesn't seem to be referring to anything tangible. And finally, oftentimes we don't have access to users or we don't have access to user research because perhaps it's in an enterprise environment or for some reason. I still try to create something that tangibly summarizes the main needs that users might have. If we have previous research, we'll use that, but if we don't, I work with the stakeholders to put their assumptions about users on paper. So I get them all in a room, and we talk about what are the main pains, what are people trying to achieve, what are people trying to do in general in the space we're working on, not necessarily just in our app. And the conversation that people start having in trying to decide what is happening, what they believe is happening with users, and then if we ask them to prioritize the pain points as well, that's a really good one. They start to engage with each other on their assumptions and realizing that not everything that they're assuming is always true. In this case, it was a workshop that we ran with the Mayor of London. They're working on an app for volunteering to encourage more people to volunteer. And it's just a workshop we did. They brought some of the user research they had in, and we started putting things on the board. And how we would use something like this is we'd have a user profile, or perhaps you can do it quickly with a proto-persona or something that you can put on the wall and say, this is our point of reference outside of our heads that we're going to use and focus on solving these problems. So it really helps for that. And in general, I would say with a client who is prone to this kind of, I don't want to say corporate, but this kind of behavior where they're used to designing from opinion, give them a point of reference by bringing the voices of end users into the boardroom. So condition number 2 will be familiar to pretty much everyone who's worked with clients. I call this the nit-picker. And you'll see a nitpicker when you ask someone, and this is a true story, a client comes in and they say, we started working on this app, we don't think it's in the right direction, we really want you to save it and make it into a better product. And say, okay, what's your main problem? And they say, our main problem is we think that the control on this slider is not exactly the right size. I'm like, hold on a second, what does your app do? And in fact, that's one of the symptoms that I see right away is when people go straight to the interface, into the detail, into the 1-pixel borders, start talking to you about colors before they've defined what the product will do. And oftentimes, those are the people who are going to really struggle to answer what is the main problem your product solves. And so what I've noticed is, even though this can be very annoying, this is actually something that I can really relate to. Because what I found is often with clients who come to me and they're in that kind of headspace, they're actually also end users of apps, and they're used to looking at interfaces, they're used to looking at the tangible stuff, how things are made, but they're not used to thinking about what it might be solving, why it's built in that way, and they're not as comfortable talking about those abstract things. So what I do with clients like this is I create ways for us to always be able to zoom all the way up from the detail level, which inevitably comes on the project, up onto the more abstract level. And there are a couple of things that have really helped for us to do that. The first one is storyboard. But before I tell you how we do storyboards, I'd like to show you an amazing example that I found in a TED Talk recently for someone who's found a way to tell a story about what exactly their vision for the product was in a very simple way.
Still noodling on this problem. It was still nagging at me. And I started thinking about it again. And I said, let me just focus briefly on what I wanted as a pick worker, or my vision for how it should work. I said, let's focus on the problem. I have an order here, and what I want to do is I want to put red, green, and blue in this box right here. What I need is a system where I put out my hand and poof, the product shows up, and I pack it into the order, and now we're thinking this would be a very operator-centric approach to solving the problem. This is what I need.
So this is a person who had the task of redesigning a warehouse where pick workers were putting together packages to send out. And the problem that they had is that they were going to all the shelves and wasting a lot of time getting those products. And he wanted to redesign that warehouse, but he didn't know how. So he said, this is my vision, is a person reaching and getting a product. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but we're going to figure it out. So he got the why and the what first. And then they redesigned the layout of the warehouse entirely. They changed the process of pick workers' work, and they created a robotic system that brought products screenshots to them. But all of that was inspired by this compass that they created that they could always use to remind them what the original vision was. And so, of course, if you can create videos, that's awesome, and I've seen that done before. But what we do with our clients is we give them a storyboard template, and we ask them to do a very similar thing to what we just saw. We say, imagine a person who has a problem, the main problem that you want your app to solve. Imagine them and draw them really suffering, going, oh, and stuff like that. And you'll see some of the drawings our clients made, who are actually not 5 years old, but I always say you don't need to be able to draw. And then once you get to that problem, imagine the superhero moment. So the app, which is now in this future reality, is already out in the world. It comes in and it saves this person and draw what is the reality after they've used the app. How is it solving the problem? And they're not allowed to use any drawings of screens. They have to draw the story. Kudos to the people who, in my workshops, have also agreed to actually act out the story. So I do this when clients and stakeholders are a little bit more loose, and I tell them, great, you've drawn the storyboard, now go and act it out. And it's usually a lot of fun. But what it does is it helps to always remind ourselves, weeks, months down the line, when we're talking about the 1 pixel line, we can see, is this feature idea, is this detail, is this thing that we're talking about actually helping us achieve this? If not, let's rethink. So it really helps to pull them up. And finally, very simply, whenever we talk about any kind of ideas or features, we also ask that clients prioritize them in one column. And this is something that is inspired if you worked in an Agile Scrum kind of methodology. I've brought it into when we define products as well. We start thinking about what's most important, and more importantly, we get stakeholders to design their own column, and then we get together and we make sure everyone talks about why the priorities are there. And so we bring all their ideas in one pile, all the user needs that we've prioritized in a column, the goals that we've prioritized in a column, and then we say, okay, what is the most important thing, and organize it. And those conversations that happen between people are really the work. It's not that I couldn't go away and tell them what I think is best for the product from what we've learned together. It's that they need to arrive at that point with me, which really helps, and we can also refer to this later on. And finally, whenever I do face clients who want to become involved and still stay in that space of talking about the detail, I always ask them, okay, we've defined the business goals that this app needs to solve for you. This idea that we're talking about, can you describe to me how it's going to help one of them? So again, going from the little detail to the function to the goal, and it really helps to pull them all the way up and helps them to navigate those levels of abstraction that maybe they're not so comfortable with. The most important thing for clients who are super, super into detail is to create something tangible that they can hold, that you can put on the wall, that you can look at for 5 minutes and remind yourself what the vision was. I would avoid any kind of conversation or discussion, because those things get lost and then we're not able to remember them anymore. And when you create something with clients that is tangible, that they had a hand in creating, you also get that ownership for them to say, oh yeah, I'm getting off track. So they kind of police themselves, which is really nice. The final condition I want to talk to you about, I call the UX/UI Webmaster Yoga Teacher Unicorn Seeker. It's a bit of a mouthful. I stole it from a job board the other day. No, I made it up. But the point is, this is a person who asks you things like, oh, you do UX? Can you spruce up my interface? Or asks you to just, do your magic on the last day of the project. Or maybe they say, oh, great, I'd love to do some UX work. Forget about user research. Can you, whip me up something in Photoshop? And so what I find is, this is a client where I need to do my most meditation, because of course I find it very infuriating, right? Because this is someone who doesn't understand what I do. And that's exactly the point. This is someone who is confused about what I do, what the value of what I do is, and how I can help them. And while it can be very frustrating, it's worth looking into it. It can be tricky because it's often related to the way that the business the client's in has worked before. If you're involved at the very end, it's not so easy to change, but it's really, really worth starting that process when you meet a new client that you want to work with, starting the process of changing this, because you will be able to do your job better for them as well. And what we do with clients like this is we try to do a little bit of almost like a crash course for them to start understanding UX a lot better so they can understand the value of what they're paying me to do, and do it in a way that is gentle and relatively quick. So what are some of the things that we've done before? The first thing that I always do is I start to signal the breadth and scope of what I can do by asking difficult questions. So from the first engagement, I start asking about prioritization questions, learning about the business, learning about the strategy. And sometimes you'll see the client kind of understanding, okay, I may have misunderstood what you do here exactly, and those conversations can help to get you to the right starting point. I also always try to expose my decision-making whenever I show something concrete to them that I've done, because the nature of client work is that I suppose it's a good thing. They don't sit next to you all day and watch you work. And there's so much that goes on in my mind, all these things that I'm referring to, things that I'm thinking about. And when I come to a decision to put something on paper, I've thought through it many, many times, but they weren't there for that process. So what I do is I bring them in with me in the way that I present my work. So this is a very, very quick wireframe that I pulled together just for this. And this is based on a discussion that I had with a client last week. So we were talking about an app that had some content and some actions, and the client asked me, shouldn't we take these two buttons in the middle of the screen and turn them into icons and put them on the navigation bar? And I said, no, because first of all, your content is such and such, and the buttons refer to it, and it helps people to understand the relationship better. Also, we said that there's a really big business goal for people to bookmark stuff. So it's good for it to be in one place, and we don't want to move the button down there. And we started to talk about all the thinking process that I had, and I told them, I've considered putting the buttons all the way down. I considered putting them up there. But then I knew those functions were too important, and we couldn't communicate them in an icon. So there was a way to take them away from the idea that my job was literally to draw boxes wherever I thought they fit. And it was about showing that all the conversations we had before and all the priorities we discussed are in my mind, and I'm solving that problem for them. And it really helps them get on board with that. Sometimes I bring clients in and we sketch together. And sometimes I get stakeholders to sketch with each other, and I facilitate it so they can understand the process of taking a scenario, taking a goal, and starting to create the interface, because it helps them to understand how many iterations it takes and how long it might take to get to the right solution. Finally, if nothing else works, I call this the nuclear option. In all honesty, if nothing else works, sometimes I think, okay, can I find a way to scare the client just a little bit so they understand all the bad things that can happen to their product and their project if we don't approach this the correct way? And I do this by thinking about what are the consequences of getting the app wrong, so to speak, and I talk to them about that in terms that they would understand. So I always have an arsenal of statistics or information from around the industry, and depending on the client and their industry, I'll talk to them about what might happen if we don't define the project properly, what might happen if we have to redo things, what might happen if why projects also fail. So one of my favorite things to talk about is there's some research that says that of the 12 reasons that software projects fail, the top 3 have to do with stakeholder politics and with lack of definition of a product. So I talk to them about, okay, there are things that are real risks that we can avoid together if we go on this journey in the right way. And the way I do this is in the beginning of the interaction with the client, I'll try and tell them, okay, this is how we work, here's our process, and here are the reasons we do it this way. And I'm here to help you with communication between stakeholders. I'm here to help you with defining what your product will do. I'm here to do all those things. It's not just about, taking a list of requirements and drawing the wireframes. So again, this can be a bit of a journey because obviously we don't want to assume that people don't get it and they're getting it wrong, but we do want to bring them in with us because people who are empowered to understand how user experience work can help them can also help us do our work better and to come in with their ideas and to help us. So those are 9 methods that have worked really well with me for clients in situations where we need to adjust the relationship a little bit and develop it in order to avoid some of the common conditions that I've seen over the years with clients. And I see my job as being able to diagnose by seeing those symptoms and helping clients through a toolkit that we've developed. And we're now in the process of creating a knowledge base inside of our department and our company where we put all the tools and the slides and the methods, all the worksheets that we've been using with clients into one place in order for everyone to be on the same page with what are some of the things that they can draw on when they come across these kinds of challenges. So many years ago, I used to see doing design with clients as a process where I had an imagined potential to my work, and then I saw that potential being shattered by the fact that I worked with a client because they would drag me down. And now I see it differently. I found that over the years, in great relationships with clients, I was able to draw on their expertise and knowledge, and everything that we created together by getting hands-on work together, and it propelled my work even higher. And I was able to create more significant and more useful products for the spaces that my clients are working in. And if I ever forget this lesson, I can go back home to Israel and I see the trucks that I designed when I was 14. Now, 2 things happen when I see the trucks. The first thing is I pretend I have no idea what that is or have nothing to do with it because, as anyone would know, work you did when you were little is not work you want to see again. And the second thing that happens is I get a reminder that my work is not just on the screen, and my work is not just in a meeting room with Post-its with my UX friends. It's also in the boardroom, and it's also in the meeting rooms of my clients, whether it's in the enterprise space, the consumer space, and I'm able to take all the lessons from my toolkit and what I believe about designing with people and turn it to something that's helpful for work with clients too. So thank you very much. I'd love to see which of these methods you like to try, or when you do try them, I'd love to hear about it. It's always very, very nice. And thanks.
It's me trying to break the microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was one of the best
I'm
talks
sorry
I've
I beat
ever.
you with the cat gifs.
Sorry, I'll live, just.
I'm surprised you didn't mention that they should be called GIFs.
I'm not going down that road. If anybody wants to disagree, I'll speak to them later. So, very, very short on Q&A time, but there's John Cleaver's asked, what if your client has all 3 conditions, and how do you prioritize what tools to use?
Right. So if my client has all 3 conditions, they usually tend to reveal themselves in different stages of the project, luckily, because I'm guessing it would scare the hell out of me if I knew it from day one. I generally have a certain process that I follow in my mind. So it's not so much about the activities I do, but what am I trying to do in each part of the project. And so I'll tailor which particular activities we can do together and how we can address the project based on those phases. So generally, I've kind of developed almost like an introductory process that we call, at Future Workshops, we call discovery. And I can stretch it or make it bigger or smaller depending on the client, but we try to touch on all the same ingredients, finding out the main problem and defining it and making it tangible, talking about the business, but then also talking about the user needs. And in those in those kinds of processes, I try to inject and pivot depending on what's coming up in the workshop. So I think everyone, when I studied psychology, my professor said that if you see yourself in all of the disorders, it doesn't mean you have them. It just means that you're studying really hard, and everyone has a little bit of OCD and a little bit of everything in them. And I think every client has a little bit of all these three conditions in them. It's just about how you position yourself and which methods you try. And if something doesn't work, I admit it, and I try another thing until we get the ingredients that we need. Because at the end, it's about the relationship for me, but it's also about creating this app that we're building, and there are things that I need to be able to do a good job with that. So I work hard until I'm able to get those ingredients in place.
Thank you for mentioning discovery as well. It's obviously something that we have at GDS and the DWP. Thank you very much.
Thank you.